Hello, this is Dr. Joe Muscolino. The following is an AI-generated simulated podcast of the contents of my ebook. I've created this and providing this because I believe that it is a very casual way and a comfortable way of listening to and absorbing the information. I hope you do enjoy it.
All right, get ready to go deep because today we are tackling something that anyone who's ever, gone for a run, taken a walk, or even just walked to the kitchen has relied on the magnificent Achilles tendon.
It really is incredible when you think about it, how much we depend on this one seemingly simple structure.
Absolutely. And we're not just talking about avoiding a little stiffness here. We're going deep, really understanding how to keep this essential body part in top shape.
Like in a deep dive for your deep tissue.
Exactly. And our guide for this journey is the one and only Dr. Joe Muscolino and his really interesting manual therapy approach.
And that's right up your alley, right?
Yeah.
You're a big fan of his work.
I am. I'm fascinated by his perspective, how he views the body as this interconnected system. When I hear manual therapy, I imagine someone who doesn't just treat the symptom, but really understands those underlying imbalances.
And that's Dr. Muscolino to a T.
Mm-hmm.
What's really cool is how he breaks down these, kind of complex conditions into really manageable steps. So he's really empowering people to take control of their own healing.
Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty of treatment, I think it's worth just a quick refresher on what the Achilles tendon actually is and what it does. We hear the name, but what's its claim to fame in the world of anatomy?
Well, picture this.
Yeah.
You've got this powerful lever connecting your calf muscles, and that's your gastrocnemius and your soleus, for those of you keeping track at home. And it connects those muscles right to your heel bone. That is your Achilles tendon in action.
So it's like the bridge between these powerful muscles and the bone that literally lets us lift our heels.
Exactly. Every step you take, every time you rise up onto your toes, that motion, that's your Achilles tendon.
Yeah.
It's transferring all that force, propelling you forward. I mean, talk about an unsung hero of movement, right?
Totally. But like many heroes, I feel like it's often taken for granted until something goes wrong. And when it comes to the Achilles, those something wrongs are often due to the demands we put on it. Dr. Muscolino talks a lot about certain groups being more prone to Achilles issues, right?
He does. And, we've all heard of the classic weekend warrior, right?
Oh, yeah.
The person who goes from, 0 to 60 with their activity, maybe without realizing that their body needs time to adapt.
Yeah.
So you've got that sudden spike in stress. Combine that with maybe tight calf muscles.
Mm.
Well, that's kind of a recipe for disaster for your Achilles tendon.
It's like flooring the gas pedal when the engine's cold, Something's got to give. And it sounds like Dr. Muscolino is really big on that early detection and intervention, right?
Absolutely. And that's why we're going to get into the different types of Achilles tendon disorders that he outlines. It's not just one thing.
Yeah, let's name these villains, right? So most people have probably heard of tendonitis, but I know Dr. Muscolino gets into a few other variations that I'll admit I'm less familiar with.
Right. So let's start with tendonitis because it's so common. And it's not just a fancy way of saying you have pain. Tendonitis means there's actual inflammation happening in the tendon itself.
So it's your body's way of saying, hey, pay attention, something's up here.
Exactly. Now, on the other hand, you have tendinosis, which is a little sneakier. So instead of being about inflammation, tendinosis is about the actual degeneration of those tendon fibers. So kind of like imagine your tendon fibers like a tightly woven rope.
Yeah.
Tendinosis is like those strands are starting to fray and weaken over time.
Okay, so if tendonitis is like that acute flare-up, tendinosis is like the slow burn, that wear and tear that can really sneak up on you.
You got it.
Yeah.
Now, Dr. Muscolino also talks about peritendinitis and bursitis. And these are two conditions that actually affect the tissues around the Achilles tendon.
Oh, interesting. So it's not the tendon itself, but its neighbors are causing trouble.
Right. So peritendinitis is when that sheath surrounding the tendon gets inflamed, whereas bursitis, that involves the bursae. And bursae are those fluid-filled sacs that help the tendon glide smoothly. So they're like the support crew for your Achilles tendon.
It's all connected. And then, of course, there's the one we all dread, the dreaded rupture. I've heard people describe it as this sudden pop. Is that accurate?
Unfortunately, it often is. That popping sensation, it's usually the telltale sign of a complete or partial tear of the Achilles tendon.
Yeah, that's definitely not something you want to mess around with. So we've met our cast of characters, so to speak. We've got tendonitis, tendinosis, those support crew issues. Now let's get into the why. Why are these problems so common? And more importantly, what can we do to prevent them from happening in the first place?
Well, like we were saying earlier, that sudden ramp up in activity, that classic weekend warrior syndrome, huge risk factors, especially if those muscles aren't prepared.
Right, because our bodies thrive on consistency, not being shocked into action.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
So gradual progression is key, but what does that actually look like? Say someone's been pretty sedentary and they want to get moving again. Where do they even begin?
And that's where Dr. Muscolino's focus on individual assessment is so important. He's not about generic advice, it's all about meeting people where they're at. So for someone starting from scratch, it could be as simple as short walks, gradually increasing the distance and the intensity over time can make a world of difference.
It's like building a house, right? You're not going to start with the roof. You've got to have that solid foundation.
100%. And speaking of foundations, Dr. Muscolino talks a lot about the importance of proper foot and ankle mechanics because, if there's dysfunction in those areas, it can actually ripple upwards and put all this extra stress on the Achilles tendon.
Which makes sense, right? Our feet are literally what connect us to the ground. If they're out of whack, it's going to throw everything above them off kilter.
Exactly. In fact, a lot of times he sees patients with Achilles issues and they have limited ankle dorsiflexion.
Ankle dorsey what now?
Dorsiflexion. Say that 5 times fast. But basically, it means, how much you can bring your toes up towards your shin.
Okay, got it.
So that range of motion, if it's limited, that puts more strain on your Achilles.
Ah, okay. So if your ankle is kind of stiff, it's going to make that Achilles tendon work harder.
Exactly. And that's where, Dr. Muscolino might incorporate something like joint mobilization to gently kind of restore that proper movement in the foot and ankle. It's all about addressing those underlying imbalances that could be contributing.
So we've got gradual progression. We're addressing any foot or ankle issues that might be brewing. What else should people be thinking about in terms of prevention?
Well, remember those tight calf muscles we were talking about? They're often a big culprit. Dr. Muscolino is all about regular stretching.
Yeah.
Especially targeting the gastrocnemius and the soleus muscles.
Right. The two big players in the calf department. So I'm guessing when he says stretching, he's not talking about like a quick toe touch before you go for a run.
Oh, absolutely not. This is dedicated stretching time. Holding those stretches for, an adequate amount of time, multiple times throughout the day. He actually shows a bunch of different variations in his book, like you can do them standing, seated, lying down.
So it's really like a whole stretching routine tailored for the Achilles.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense. And speaking of tailored, Dr. Muscolino also points out that even our footwear choices can play a role in Achilles' health.
Right, and this goes back to the dorsiflexion thing. Think about high heels for a second.
I think I know where you're going with this.
So high heels, right, they keep your calf muscles in this shortened position. And over time, that can lead to adaptive shortening, which then limits, guess what, ankle dorsiflexion, and puts more stress on that Achilles tendon.
I never really thought about high heels having that long-term impact, So, is it a matter of ditching the heels altogether or just being more mindful, finding balance?
Like most things in life, I think it's about balance,
Mm-hmm.
If you love wearing heels, great. But Dr. Muscolino would probably say, make sure you're incorporating stretches that are really targeting those calf muscles just to counteract those shortening effects.
Interest? So be mindful of the shoes and then counteract with the stretching.
Got it. Okay, now what about age? Because, I know as we get older, things tend to get a little creakier, tendons included. Is that just a natural part of aging, or is there more to the story? Yeah, it is true that, as we age, our tendons naturally, they lose a bit of elasticity, which makes them more prone to injury. But Dr. Muscolino really emphasizes that this doesn't mean we have to just resign ourselves to a life of, achy tendons.
It's not about stopping movement altogether. It's just about adapting.
Exactly. It might mean adjusting the intensity, maybe the duration of our workouts, making sure we're taking enough rest days, or even, prioritizing activities that are a little easier on the joints.
So listening to your body becomes even more crucial as you get older. It's not about pushing through the pain. It's about finding that sweet spot where you can be active but not overdoing it.
Exactly. And this kind of leads to another point that Dr. Muscolino brings up, which is weight management. And, it's not about promoting a certain body type or anything like that, but just recognizing that, excess weight does put more stress on all of our joints, the Achilles tendon included.
Again, basic physics, right? The more weight your body has to manage, the harder those tendons have to work every step you take.
Exactly. So maintaining a healthy weight, through, diet and exercise can go a long way in terms of prevention.
It really highlights how amazing our bodies are, but also how important it is to treat them with care, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say someone is experiencing some of those telltale Achilles issues, the pain, the stiffness, that decreased range of motion. What happens next? What does treatment look like from Dr. Muscolino's perspective?
So he actually approaches treatment in two main phases,
Mm-hmm.
acute and chronic. So let's start with that acute phase, which is all about damage control.
So someone's in pain. What are those first things Dr. Muscolino recommends? Is it that classic RICE protocol?
You know it.
Rest, ice, compression?
RICE is still the gold standard for that initial, inflammation. Got to bring that inflammation down.
It's funny how those old standbys, they really work. But I'm guessing Dr. Muscolino doesn't just stop there.
Of course not. He likes to get hands-on. So he might incorporate some gentle massage, nothing too aggressive, just to kind of improve the circulation, maybe reduce some of that muscle tension around the area.
So really gentle, just kind of supporting that natural healing process.
Exactly. And then as that acute inflammation starts to calm down, that's when he'll start to incorporate those more targeted manual therapy techniques to really address, the underlying causes.
Okay, so let's talk techniques. What are some of Dr. Muscolino's go-tos for those chronic Achilles tendon issues?
Well, he talks a lot about cross-fiber massage.
Right. And this is good for breaking up scar tissue, that kind of thing.
Especially those adhesions.
Yeah, and remind me, how does that actually work? I remember we talked about this earlier, but
Yeah, so imagine you're working with a piece of dough, right? If you only need it in one direction, it might still be kind of tough. But that cross-fiber massage, it's like you're coming at that dough from all different angles. You're breaking up those stubborn knots.
so it's not just rubbing along the length of the tendon, it's really getting in there.
Exactly. Got to work those tissues from different directions.
Okay, that makes sense. So cross-fiber massage, what else?
And of course, those stretches. He's really big on emphasizing those stretches for both the gastrocnemius and the soleus, making sure you're doing them consistently and with proper form.
So it's that holistic approach, right? Muscles, tendons, those surrounding tissues, got to get them all on board. Are there any other, I don't know if you call them treatments, but anything else that he might recommend for those chronic Achilles issues?
He often uses something called eccentric strengthening exercises.
Eccentric strengthening. Okay, that sounds kind of intense.
It's not as scary as it sounds. It's basically like you're slowly lengthening a muscle while it's under tension.
So is that when you're doing a calf raise, it's that lowering part?
Exactly. He'll start with really gentle eccentric exercises and then gradually increase the intensity. It's really helpful for strengthening the tendon and just making it, better able to handle all that stress.
So you're giving those tendons a crash course in resilience. Love it. Okay, now I want to bring up a real life example because remember earlier when we were talking about that whole weekend warrior thing?
Yeah.
And how that sudden increase in activity can really do you in. Dr. Muscolino talks about this case study in his guide, a woman named Rolla.
Oh, yeah. Rolla's case. That's a good one because it really shows how even seemingly harmless activities can become a problem if you're not careful. She was in her early 40s, I think. And she had a pretty sedentary job, but she decided she was going to get into shape.
Good for her.
Right. So she starts walking.
Walking. I mean, what could go wrong, right?
Well, it wasn't so much the walking itself, but, she went from basically doing nothing to 2 miles a day overnight.
Oh, no.
Yeah, classic weekend warrior. And sure enough, within a few weeks, her Achilles tendon is killing her. She's got all the classic tendonitis signs, the swelling, the warmth, pain when you touch it. She couldn't move her ankle very well.
It's amazing how quickly it can go downhill when you ignore those little signs, So what did Dr. Muscolino do for her?
Well, first things first, RICE, right? Got to get that inflammation under control.
Right.
Gentle massage, stretches, especially for those tight calf muscles. But here's the key. He also made her adjust that walking routine.
So it wasn't just treating the symptoms, it was about addressing how she was actually moving in her day-to-day life.
100%. And they took it slow, gradually increasing her distance, really emphasizing the importance of warming up, those targeted stretches we were talking about. And this is so important. He really made sure she knew to listen to her body, Don't push through pain.
Rolla's story is like a good PSA for all of us, right?
Yeah.
Healing takes time, be patient with your body, and don't be afraid to seek out guidance when you need it.
Couldn't agree more.
Wow, we've covered so much ground in this deep dive. We started with like Achilles 101, the anatomy, the different types of injuries. Then we explored Dr. Muscolino's approach. So insightful. I mean, the guy's brilliant. And we even got to hear about Rola's journey. If our listeners take away just one thing from all of this, I hope it's that knowledge is power, right? Understanding how your amazing body works, what puts you at risk, how to take care of yourself, that's how we live our best lives. On that note, a huge thank you to you for diving deep with me, and to all our listeners, keep those tendons happy, and we'll see you next time.
This is Dr. Joe Muscolino again. You've just listened to the AI-generated simulated podcast of the contents located within the ebook. I hope you enjoyed listening to this podcast and you found it informational. Thank you.